The moment a police officer feels the cold click of handcuffs around his own wrists is the moment he realizes the badge was never armor. Officer Daniel Hayes stood in the center of his precinct, fluorescent lights buzzing above him. The same bullpen where he had given orders now silent as winter, his fellow officers staring at the floor as if eye contact itself could be used as evidence. And the metal against his skin felt heavier than it ever had on anyone else. 48 hours earlier, he had been the one standing tall beneath flashing red and blue lights on a quiet suburban road just outside Baltimore, where 17-year-old Aaliyah Brooks was driving home from a late study session. Her small sedan pulled over for what the report would later call a routine traffic stop. The air that night had been cool, barely 50 degrees, the kind of chill that makes your breath visible under street lamps. And Hayes had approached her window, already convinced he knew her story before she spoke a single word. Imagine standing there at 17, hands steady on the steering wheel, watching an officer's expression shift from neutral to suspicious without explanation. Words were exchanged, sharp but ordinary, yet something invisible hardened in the space between them, something built from assumption rather than fact. By sunrise, Aaliyah would be lying in a hospital bed, monitors humming softly at 72 beats per minute, her mother gripping the railing as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. But inside the precinct, Hayes had signed off on a report that sounded clean, controlled, justified, and the department backed it without hesitation, citing procedure, compliance, protocol. What he did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that Aaliyah's mother, Monica Brooks, was not just another grieving parent pacing a hospital corridor. She had once stood in federal courtrooms where careers ended with a single piece of evidence, and she understood something Hayes had forgotten. Truth does not rush, it waits. Now, as the captain cleared his throat and a federal investigator stepped forward with a tablet in hand, Hayes felt the shift in the room, subtle but undeniable, like pressure dropping before a storm. The unedited body camera footage had surfaced, time-stamped, backed up, impossible to explain away, and as the screen flickered to life, the same building that once echoed with his authority grew painfully quiet. The cuffs tightened slightly as he adjusted his stance, and for the first time in years, Officer Daniel Hayes was not the one asking questions. He was the one about to answer them. He had worn the badge believing it made him untouchable, but in that still, suffocating silence, he began to understand something far more powerful had just walked through those doors. The video did not begin with shouting or chaos. It began with something far more dangerous, calm certainty. On the screen inside the precinct conference room, the timestamp glowed in the upper corner, 11:43 p.m., and the body camera showed Officer Daniel Hayes stepping out of his cruiser beneath the wash of red and blue lights reflecting off a quiet Maryland roadway. The night looked ordinary, a stretch of asphalt lined with bare trees and modest homes set back behind narrow lawns. The kind of place where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. Aaliyah Brooks sat inside her sedan with both hands visible on the steering wheel, exactly where driver education tells you to keep them, her breath faintly fogging the glass in the 50-degree air. Her voice, when it first appeared on the recording, was steady, respectful, asking why she had been stopped. Hayes responded with the confidence of someone who had never had to question his own authority, explaining that she had failed to signal long enough before a turn, a minor traffic infraction that usually ends with a warning. But as the seconds passed, something subtle shifted, not in her posture, not in her tone, but in his. He repeated his questions even after she answered them, asking where she was coming from, who she had been with, why she was out so late on a school night. Each inquiry less about traffic and more about assumption. Imagine standing there in the glow of flashing lights, feeling judged before you are heard. The camera captured Aaliyah explaining she had been at a study group, her backpack visible in the passenger seat, textbooks stacked neatly inside. She complied when asked for her license and registration, moving slowly, narrating her motions the way teenagers are taught to do in households that have had this conversation more than once. There was no raised voice from her, no sudden movement, no thread in the frame. Only tension building in the silence between sentences. Hayes called for backup anyway, and another cruiser rolled in, tires crunching lightly over gravel at the shoulder. Procedure, the report would later say. Caution, officer safety. Yet the footage showed a different story, one of escalation that did not come from the driver's seat. When Aaliyah asked again if she was free to leave after receiving a citation, her question hung in the cold air unanswered. Instead, the interaction stretched longer than necessary, stretching into discomfort, stretching into something that felt less like enforcement and more like control. Inside the hospital room miles away in the present timeline, Monica Brooks watched a similar screen on a federal investigator's tablet, her face unreadable, absorbing every second her daughter had lived through. Back in the precinct conference room, the officers shifted in their chairs as the footage continued, because what it revealed was not a dramatic explosion but a pattern, a tone, a presumption, layered into each exchange. And patterns are far harder to defend than moments. Daniel Hayes kept his eyes forward as the playback rolled on, but the certainty he once carried like a shield was beginning to crack under the weight of his own recorded words. Silence can be louder than sirens, and inside the conference room that silence began to press against every wall as the footage continued to play. The second patrol car had arrived, and Officer Mark Collins stepped into frame, his posture guarded, his presence turning a simple stop into a scene that felt staged for suspicion. Aaliyah remained seated at first, her window lowered halfway, answering questions that circled back on themselves, explaining again that she was 17 years old, that she had just left a study group 3 miles away, that her mother was expecting her home before midnight. The camera captured the tremor in her breathing, but also the discipline in her voice, the way she chose her words carefully as if each sentence were being graded. When she was asked to step out of the vehicle, she did so slowly, keeping her hands visible, sneakers touching the pavement under the rotating wash of emergency lights. There was no chaos in the frame, only a growing imbalance of power, 2 uniformed officers standing tall while a teenage girl stood beneath their scrutiny. Hayes continued asking questions that had already been answered, his tone sharpening, suggesting noncompliance where the footage showed cooperation. Collins shifted his weight, glancing between Hayes and Aaliyah as if waiting for direction. Imagine the cold air against your face at nearly midnight, neighbors watching through curtains, your heartbeat echoing louder than the traffic passing half a mile away. The body camera recorded every second without emotion, yet emotion filled the room where it was being replayed. At one point Aaliyah asked if she could call her mother, her voice steady but urgent, and that request lingered, unanswered. Procedure was cited again. Officer safety repeated like a shield. But the more the video unfolded, the clearer it became that control, not danger, had defined the interaction. Then came the moment when the screen jolted, not from an attack or a threat, but from confusion and rapid movement, voices overlapping, commands repeated faster than understanding could follow. The image tilted toward the asphalt, flashing lights streaking across the lens, and then the audio shifted into strained breathing and radio chatter. The footage did not need to show what happened next to make its point, because context had already done the work. Back in the present, the investigator paused the video just before the final minutes, allowing the weight of what had been seen to settle over the room. Daniel Hayes felt heat rise beneath his collar despite the cool air conditioning, because what the recording revealed was not a single mistake, but a pattern of escalation without cause. Across town in a hospital room lit by soft white monitors, Monica Brooks stood beside her daughter's bed, watching the same sequence on a separate device, her expression composed, absorbing every frame. She did not cry, she did not speak, she simply watched, and in that stillness there was something far more formidable than anger. As the paused image flickered on the screen, frozen in a blur of red and blue light, the truth no longer belonged to reports or statements. It belonged to the timestamp that could not be argued with. Truth does not explode all at once, it tightens slowly, like a room losing oxygen, and as the paused frame lingered on the conference room screen, the federal investigator let the silence stretch until even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt accusatory. Daniel Hayes swallowed, his jaw set, but the confidence he once wore so easily had thinned into something brittle. The video resumed, showing the final minutes. Before paramedics arrived, not with graphic detail but with confusion, overlapping commands, and a teenage voice growing faint beneath the rush of authority. The timestamp advanced steadily, impartial and precise. marking each second that would later be debated in statements and reports. When the footage ended, the screen went black, reflecting the faces of every officer seated at the long table. No one spoke at first. Then the investigator placed a printed document beside the tablet, a copy of the official incident report signed by Hayes less than 2 hours after the stop. The language in the report was clinical, controlled, describing resistance that the video did not clearly show, describing necessary force where the footage suggested escalation without immediate threat. The gap between what was written and what was seen hung heavy in the air. Across town, in a hospital room washed in soft white light, Monica Brooks stood beside her daughter's bed, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor measuring time in quiet beeps. Aaliyah lay still, a band around her wrist displaying her name. Her future paused at 17. Monica did not cry, not because she did not feel, but because she understood that emotion without strategy changes nothing. She had once stood in federal courtrooms where careers unraveled over discrepancies smaller than this. She had built cases on inconsistencies, on tone, on the difference between perception and proof. When she finished watching the footage, she did not raise her voice. She reached for her phone and stepped into the hallway, the scent of antiseptic sharp in the air, and dialed a number she had not used in years. Her voice was calm when the line connected, measured, almost gentle. She requested a formal review, cited federal statutes, referenced civil rights protections that existed long before that traffic stop. Back in the precinct, the captain shifted uneasily as the investigator cleared his throat and explained that the footage had been automatically backed up to a cloud server before any edits could be made. There would be an internal affairs inquiry, followed by a federal examination. Procedures would be audited, statements re-examined, timelines reconstructed down to the minute. Hayes felt the weight of every second he had once controlled. He had believed the badge gave him narrative authority, the power to define what happened and how it would be remembered. But narrative collapses under evidence, and evidence had begun to speak. In the hospital corridor, Monica ended her call and returned to her daughter's bedside, placing her hand gently over Aaliyah's. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a promise stronger than anger. She did not vow revenge. She did not threaten retaliation. She vowed truth. And in that quiet vow lay something far more dangerous to a broken system than outrage, because outrage fades, but truth endures. By the next morning, the story had already begun to split into two versions, one printed on official letterhead, and one living inside a hospital room where machines whispered instead of people. At 7:30 a.m., the department released a brief statement describing the incident as an encounter that required firm response due to perceived noncompliance. Careful words arranged to sound responsible, controlled, justified. Local news stations repeated the language almost exactly, their anchors, reading from teleprompters beneath banners that reduced a 17-year-old girl to a headline. Inside the hospital, sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, casting thin lines across Aaliyah's still face, her chest rising and falling with assisted rhythm, each breath measured in steady electronic tones. Monica Brooks stood beside her daughter with the composure of someone who understood that public narratives can harden quickly if left unchallenged. She listened to the press conference on her phone without reacting to the phrases chosen to protect the institution rather than the child. When the chief of police expressed confidence in his officers and asked the community for patience, Monica paused the video and looked at her daughter's hand resting against the white sheet. Patience was a word often used by those who were not the ones waiting beside hospital beds. By mid-morning, attorneys representing the department had begun contacting city officials, preparing internal timelines, aligning statements, reviewing policies that could be cited as justification. Inside the precinct, Daniel Hayes remained on administrative leave, instructed not to speak publicly, advised to trust the process. He told himself the footage could be interpreted in different ways, that context mattered, that split-second decisions were difficult for civilians to understand. Yet beneath those rehearsed defenses lingered the image of the paused frame, the tilt of the camera, the tone of his own voice replaying in his memory without distortion. Meanwhile, Monica placed another call, this time not to an old colleague but to a civil rights division contact within the Department of Justice, her words deliberate, referencing specific statutes and requesting an independent review under federal oversight. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply outlined the discrepancy between the written report and the recorded evidence. By early afternoon, word of a potential federal inquiry began circulating quietly through City Hall, shifting the atmosphere from confident dismissal to cautious concern. Reporters started asking different questions, less about compliance and more about transparency. At 3:15 p.m., a formal request for all related footage, dispatch logs, and officer communication records was submitted, not by a protester or a commentator, but by a mother who understood procedure better than most officers in that building. Back in the hospital room, Monica leaned closer to her daughter and spoke softly, describing the sunlight, the weather outside, the sound of traffic drifting in from the highway a mile away, grounding her child in a world that had not stopped turning. She promised nothing dramatic, no vengeance, no spectacle. She promised that the truth would not be buried beneath paperwork. And across town, as administrators reviewed emails and attorneys revised statements, the first tremor of accountability moved through the department like a quiet fault line, unseen but impossible to ignore. Accountability does not arrive with flashing lights. It arrives with paperwork, signatures, and quiet footsteps in government hallways. And by the second evening after the incident, the atmosphere inside the police department had shifted from confidence to containment. A formal notice from the Department of Justice was delivered electronically at 5:42 p.m., requesting preservation of all digital evidence, including body camera backups, dashboard footage, radio transmissions, and internal emails related to the stop. The wording was precise, leaving little room for interpretation, and it carried the weight of federal oversight that no local statement could soften. Inside his home, Daniel Hayes sat at his kitchen table staring at the notification forwarded to him by the union representative, the same hands that once adjusted his badge now gripping a coffee mug gone cold. He replayed the night in fragments, searching for a version that justified his tone, his decisions, his insistence, but memory is unreliable when compared to video, and the gap between what he believed and what had been recorded continued to widen. Across town, Monica Brooks reviewed the official response from the department with the steady focus of someone trained to dissect language. She noted what was included and what was omitted, how responsibility was framed as uncertainty, how concern was expressed without acknowledgement. She drafted a formal statement of her own, not for cameras, but for investigators, outlining the timeline down to the minute, referencing the medical report that confirmed her daughter had arrived at the hospital unconscious, referencing the footage that contradicted claims of escalating threat. In the hospital room, Aaliyah remained still, the monitor tracing gentle green lines across a dark screen, each rise and fall a reminder that life persists even when justice stalls. Nurses moved quietly, adjusting equipment, speaking in low voices that respected both privacy and gravity. Monica leaned close and described the day to her daughter, the way the sky had turned pale gray before rain, the way reporters now waited outside the precinct instead of the hospital, the way truth was beginning to surface beyond closed doors. At 9:10 p.m., an internal email circulated among department supervisors instructing all personnel to refrain from deleting any records and to prepare for interviews with federal agents. Some officers reacted with frustration, others with anxiety, but a few with relief, as if the burden of silence had grown too heavy to carry. Hayes felt that shift most sharply when Officer Mark Collins declined to meet privately, choosing instead to cooperate fully with the inquiry. Loyalty, once assumed, was now uncertain. By midnight, the narrative that had seemed stable that morning was unraveling under scrutiny, not because of outrage in the streets, but because documentation does not bend to hierarchy. Monica finally rested in a chair beside her daughter's bed, exhaustion visible but resolve intact. She did not seek revenge, she sought correction. And somewhere between the quiet hum of hospital equipment and the steady ticking of clocks inside city offices, the balance of power continued to move, not with noise, but with inevitability. By the third morning, the word investigation no longer felt theoretical, it felt immediate. And at 8:15 a.m. 2 federal agents walked through the glass doors of the police department, carrying slim briefcases and expressions that revealed nothing. Conversations lowered as they passed, keyboards paused mid-sentence, and the quiet authority of oversight settled over the bullpen like a change in air pressure before a storm. Daniel Hayes had been instructed to report for a formal interview at 9 o'clock sharp, no uniform required, only identification. He arrived in a pressed button-down shirt, the absence of his badge on his chest more noticeable than any decoration. Inside a small conference room with neutral gray walls, a recorder was placed at the center of the table, its red light blinking steadily, impartial and patient. The questions began calmly, focused on timeline, on perception, on training, each inquiry layered carefully on top of documented evidence. Hayes answered in measured tones, repeating phrases about protocol and officer safety, emphasizing the unpredictability of roadside stops. Yet every time he referenced resistance, the agent across from him slid a printed still frame across the table, asking him to reconcile his description with what the camera had captured. Outside that room, Officer Mark Collins sat in a separate office providing his own account. Unlike Hayes, his responses began to shift as he spoke, acknowledging uncertainty, admitting that the situation might not have required escalation, his voice lower than usual, as if weighed down by something heavier than policy. Word of his cooperation moved quietly through the department, altering alliances that once felt permanent. Across town, Monica Brooks met with representatives from the Civil Rights Division in a modest federal building downtown, the American flag standing in the corner of the conference room beside a seal etched into polished wood. She outlined not only what had happened that night, but what it represented, describing patterns she had witnessed years earlier in other jurisdictions, emphasizing that accountability is not an attack on law enforcement, but a reinforcement of its purpose. Her tone remained steady, grounded in statute rather than emotion, yet every sentence carried the unmistakable force of a mother who refused to let her daughter become a footnote. Back at the hospital, Aaliyah's condition remained stable but unchanged, doctors explaining that recovery would take time measured in weeks, perhaps longer, progress tracked in small neurological responses rather than dramatic awakenings. Monica returned to her daughter's bedside that evening and described the day's developments, the presence of federal agents, the seriousness of the questions being asked, the subtle shift in posture among officials who once sounded certain. She placed her hand gently over Aaliyah's and whispered that truth was moving forward, even if it moved slowly. Inside the department, administrators reviewed policies late into the night, recognizing that this was no longer a matter of public relations but of legal consequence. The red light of the recorder in that gray interview room continued blinking long after Hayes had finished speaking, preserving every word, every pause, every hesitation. And in that steady pulse of documentation, the balance of power tilted further away from assumption and closer to fact. By the end of the week, the conference room that once hosted routine briefings had transformed into a quiet chamber of consequence, blinds half drawn, a long wooden table cleared of coffee cups and casual paperwork, replaced instead with organized stacks of transcripts, printed still frames, and highlighted policy manuals. At 10 o'clock sharp, federal investigators reconvened with department leadership, their tone no longer exploratory but declarative. The findings were presented step by step. Timeline aligned against footage, statements compared against recorded audio, inconsistencies marked in calm, methodical language. Daniel Hayes sat at the far end of the table, hands folded tightly, eyes fixed on a legal pad he had not written on. When the lead investigator summarized the discrepancies between his report and the body camera recording, the room did not erupt in outrage, it tightened in recognition. Procedure had been cited repeatedly, yet the evidence suggested escalation, unsupported by immediate threat. Officer Mark Collins, seated across from him, kept his gaze lowered, having already amended his original statement to reflect uncertainty rather than affirmation. The chief of police cleared his throat once, then again, as if searching for authority in a moment that no longer belonged to him. Outside the building, reporters gathered behind metal barricades set 10 feet from the entrance, cameras mounted on tripods, microphones angled toward doors that had remained closed all morning. Inside a hospital room several miles away, Monica Brooks watched a brief update from a news alert, but quickly turned the screen face down, choosing instead to focus on her daughter's steady breathing. Aaliyah's condition had shown slight improvement, doctors noting subtle neurological responses, small signs measured not in dramatic awakenings, but in incremental change. Monica leaned closer and described the sound of rain tapping lightly against the hospital window. A gentle storm rolling through the city as if washing something unseen. Back in the conference room, the investigator concluded with a recommendation for administrative suspension pending further federal review and potential civil rights charges. The words were delivered without spectacle, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of consequence. Hayes felt the finality in the phrasing, the way responsibility had shifted from internal review to external judgment. The badge that once rested against his chest now lay sealed inside an evidence envelope, cataloged alongside digital files and sworn statements. As the meeting adjourned, no one applauded, no one argued. Chairs scraped softly against the floor, papers were gathered, and the slow machinery of accountability continued turning. Later that afternoon, an official announcement was prepared, acknowledging federal involvement and promising full cooperation. Across town, Monica received confirmation that the investigation would expand beyond individual officers to examine departmental practices. She closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in resolve. Justice, she understood, is not a single moment of reversal. It is a process that tests endurance. And as the rain outside grew steadier, washing sidewalks and streetlights in silver reflections, the city felt suspended between what had been protected and what was now being revealed, the balance tipping not with noise, but with undeniable clarity. The final shift did not happen in a courtroom or beneath flashing cameras. It happened in quiet signatures and sealed envelopes delivered before sunrise. 2 weeks after the investigation began, federal authorities announced formal civil rights charges against Daniel Hayes, citing documented discrepancies and violations of constitutional standards. And by noon he was escorted out of the same building where he once briefed younger officers on discipline and control. There were no raised voices. In the hallway, only the soft echo of footsteps and the low murmur of staff who understood that a line had been crossed and could not be redrawn. Officer Mark Collins received administrative discipline and mandatory retraining, his cooperation noted in the report, a reminder that silence and truth carry different consequences. The department itself entered into a federal oversight agreement requiring policy reform, external monitoring, and transparent reporting for the next 3 years. Restructuring measured not in headlines but in audits and compliance reviews. Outside, reporters framed the outcome as accountability, some calling it overdue, others calling it unprecedented. But inside a hospital room on the 4th floor, the only outcome that mattered was far more fragile. Aaliyah Brooks opened her eyes for the first time since that night, not fully awake, not fully aware, but responsive enough for doctors to note progress. Monica Brooks stood beside her daughter, tears finally gathering not from rage, but from relief, her hand wrapped gently around Aaliyah's fingers as if anchoring her back to the world. She did not speak about revenge. She did not celebrate the charges. She simply whispered that she was there and that the truth had held. Across town, Daniel Hayes sat alone in a small processing room. No badge on his chest, no radio at his shoulder. The hum of fluorescent lights sounding eerily similar to the night he had believed himself untouchable. He had worn authority like armor, confident that procedure would shield him. But procedure had given way to proof. The city continued moving, traffic flowing along wet streets, storefronts opening at 9 a.m., ordinary life resuming as reforms quietly took root inside a department forced to confront its own reflection. In the months that followed, new training standards were implemented, body camera protocols reinforced, supervisory reviews tightened, changes that would never make national news but would alter countless future encounters. And in that quiet transformation lay the true reversal, not a spectacle of downfall, but a recalibration of power. Because justice is not the moment the cuffs close. It is the moment the system remembers who it is meant to protect. He once believed the badge made him the law, but in the end it was the law, carried patiently by a mother who refused to yield, that redefined him.